Oh, welcome back to the channel again. Today I've got another review video of sorts. Originally recorded this while I was doing it, but it was a very long, boring video, so figured I would kind of do it as a design review instead. So what you're looking at is a shelf that I made, or well, it's a thing I put on a shelf to turn it into one, two, three, four shelves. And the idea is that with laser cutting, I use a lot of plywood and some acrylic as well. And if you store plywood any other way than perfectly flat, it has a tendency to warp. And then it's problematic at best when it comes to laser cutting. So I wanted to give myself a little bit more space to store my plywood as opposed to being multiple different types stacked on top of each other. I can stack different types on different levels, and then I don't have to try to dig out the bottom piece when I need the bottom piece, because that basically involves unstacking the entire stack to take one piece out and then restack the whole stack, and it's a bother. Um, so design this up, and what's not shown here because I wasn't actually needed to model because, well, frankly, this is a one-off deal, and I'm not going to put too much effort into it. Is that all these little holes have wood slats that I bought from the hardware store. Just they sell them as quarter inch by 2 inch by 3 feet. Although there's so much variation in those that I actually had to adapt a little bit, uh, modify my design. So when I started measuring them, I realized there was really no consistency at all. I mean, some of them would be off by 2 or 3 millimeters from one end to the next. And if I just put them all in there exactly the same, well, I'd have to make all the holes large enough for the largest one, which means the smallest ones would be super loose. And on top of that, the whole point is to create flat surfaces here for my plywood to sit on, and it wouldn't be a flat surface because they'd be some would be higher, some would be lower. So I went through with calipers, and basically I had 30 of these pieces, marked them all with a number, and marked each end. So if each one would have, say, the number 5 written in the middle of it, and then on one end it would have a 1, and the other end it would have a 2. And I measured the thickness and width of each end. And then I created variable names for each of those and stacked them up like this, copied that to Notepad so I could easily copy it into SolidWorks. And now you know why I'm doing this as a review video. Uh, so I put all my variables in there. I also added working height, which was the height from top to bottom of the existing shelf, the opening. Working depth is how deep the shelf was that I had to work with, although I don't even think I ended up using that. Kerf, obviously, just like the previous ones, so I could apply kerf in here rather than in the laser software that doesn't seem to ever do it right. And then I put thickness for the two sides and for each of the shelves, which these shelves are made of two pieces because my laser cutter isn't big enough to cut the whole shelf at once. And obviously, I'm trying to put pieces that are the maximum size for laser cutter on top of the shelves, and the shelves have to be larger than that. So I had to go through my whole stack of plywood and find, two that are the same height, or basically 3 pairs, each pair being the same thickness, which luckily I was able to find that. And then the sides, it doesn't really matter if they're the same thickness as anything else. So that's why I've got 3 different dimensions for shelf thick, and then for the side thick, where one side is considerably different than the other side, at least when it comes to a press fit like I've got here. So, with that said, start with the design review. First thing I did was I made a sketch. It was just a line that was the length of 3 feet, which is the length of the slats that I had. And I centered it on the origin and left the sketch. Used that sketch to make 2 planes right at the end of that. Then I made a sketch which I called side 1, and in that you'll see all these little red equation symbols. So basically everything, almost everything in that sketch is an equation. So this rectangle is based on the actual measurements from end 1 of piece 1. This is end 1 of piece 2, end 1 of piece 3, and so on all the way up to end 1 of piece 30. And between each of them, I put construction lines. The first one I did a midpoint constraint on this line here and made it horizontal. And I did that for each of the 3 levels. Then the rest of them I just did collinear and equal constraints. And I did that for all 3 levels as well. And that locked everything down. And then I drew a rectangle around the outside of all of it, which was 10 millimeters out, which gives enough meat that I don't have to worry about it cracking if there's a slight void or something in the plywood, which sometimes you run into. I'm making relatively big pieces. I don't want to make them twice, and I don't really care about how they look, so I was using the kind of the remnant scraps that I don't normally use that are full of knots and imperfections, so I figured 10 millimeters, give it a little bit extra safety. Then, on the same plane in the middle, I made a sketch that I called side 2. Did the same thing, only this time it's board 1 and 2, board 2 and 2, board 3 and 2, and all the way up to board 3 and 2. And I just copied the same border across as well. And each of these, if I can open it, I didn't bother putting them on the original sketch plane, or the planes that I made out here before, because they're not actually going to end up there. But I didn't want to be right on the center plane, because then they'd be on top of each other. So I just offset them by 100 millimeters and adjusted later on. And of course it offset by a variable, because at this point I hadn't actually measured the thickness of this plywood. And I did the same thing in here, except this time I offset this way instead of this way for the first one. Then I drew in these teeth, I guess you could call them, for each of the 2. Let me roll back to there actually. So I drew in the teeth, and I didn't extrude them, I just drew them in. Then I made a new sketch here, and I converted this sketch, and then I was able to just do a select like this inside that sketch, remove the teeth over here, these teeth, and do my extrude boss. And then I use that same sketch again, so they're both sketch 4, but this time I want it to be on the other end, so I just said from this surface, which I picked this end surface, I flipped the direction around so that it would be heading outwards, and then I just did it by the same side thick that this was done by, and this first panel was done by as well. Next step was I made a sketch on this surface, and I converted this sketch, and I deleted these so that only these remained, and I used that to extrude out these teeth. Then I reused that sketch to extrude out these teeth just the same as I did on the other side. From there, I drew in a rectangle at the end. This doesn't have any holes in it, it's just a simple rectangle. And it's the same thickness as this piece. And then I did the same thing on the back. And I did these two as well. So these are all just rectangles on the ends so far. Then this body move copy was I just made 2 copies of this and 2 copies of this. The reason I did that was that I could use combine subtracts. So I use this combine feature, set it to subtract mode. I said I want to start with this and subtract this. And then I did the same thing here and here and here. So I started here, subtracted that, start here, subtract that, start here, subtract that. And by doing that, I make the holes that the teeth match up with. There are other ways to do that, of course. That was just convenient. I probably could have reused the sketch, but again, sometimes you think of things afterwards. This was just the first thing that came to mind, and it worked, so whatever. Let me show that what I hit again. So this one is I wanted the numbers of all the boards as well as the ends. So this is board number 23 and 1, and made a pretty relatively complex sketch to do that. I probably could have slacked off and just used a like a pattern of this rectangle, but instead what I did was I did a converted entities. I clicked this face, and then I clicked select all inner loops. And then I selected all of those and did an offset entities and offset by 3. Then I put a midpoint on each of those. Let me select this. So on this line here, I put a midpoint on all of those. Made 30 identical rectangles like this and did a midpoint constraint there as well. And then I put my text down to the bottom line of each of those. And to set that text size, since I didn't want to set it literally every time I made a new text entity, I just went ahead and went in here to document properties and annotations, and I set the text size in there. That way it defaults every time. So that let me cut out all those letters or all those numbers. And then I did basically the same thing on the other side. So when I was assembling it, I had all the numbers engraved right on the panels, and it would have been hard to mess that up unless I was actually trying to, and thankfully I didn't. Then I just filleted the top edges. Not really necessary, I suppose, but why not? Then next step was kind of sloppy, but it works. So remember back here, I put these planes, and those are the end points of the slats that I bought from the hardware store that I don't want to modify at all. I don't want to cut them or do anything with them. I just want to use them. So I made the planes. I made these 2 planes that were based on where this was. And I used those planes plus the body move copy to move it in a straight path. And the last constraint on this body move copy was to constrain this face to this sketch. And then I did the same thing again for the other side. And then I went back to this original sketch. Well, I made a sketch in this plane. And from this original sketch, I took this line and this line, this line and this line, this line and this line, and I converted them. And then I drew in lines here, 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 and here, just to close up those rectangles. And I did an extrude boss up to here. And that's how I got these 3 surface plates. Then I reused that sketch, same sketch, and just extruded the other way up to here. And that way I get my 6 pieces from a single sketch. Then I made a new sketch on the bottom of these, which was just a line and a line. Then I made 2 center point rectangles that are centered on each of these lines. And I put my text on here. And, excuse me, this text is taller, but I only needed to do 2 of them, so I manually just changed it to a text height of 50. And get out of there. And I did the same thing for this level and the same thing for this level as well. So I had numbers engraved on all these pieces, this piece and this piece. And then these end pieces, I just remembered when I was cutting them that these 2 would go with this part. And as soon as they were cut, I hammered them together because they're designed as a press fit. And same thing over here. As soon as they're done cutting, I just hammered them together. And then I don't really need numbers because they're basically one part at that point. I put a little bit of glue too, but there probably was unnecessary. Then, because this is laser cutting, I did a flat layout. This is much larger than the capacity of my bed. Actually, this I had to do this as 8 separate cuts. Each one of these was 1 cut, and then this set of 3 was 1 cut, and this set of 3 was 1 cut. And none of them were as big as the whole bed, but any 2 of them would have been too big for the bed. And then I just started doing my offsetting, my kerf offsets. Because again, my laser software does have sort of kerf support, but anytime I've ever tried to rely on it, it's messed things up horribly. So I don't trust it in the least anymore. I just use SolidWorks to do it. And then there's one more thing that I think I put in here. And if I rotate around. So what I did here, just because these are not like a full engrave, I just did these as like a cut, but a very high speed cut, so it didn't cut all the way through, but it just left the mark. Which for these it's fine because they're relatively small and close together, and it looks right. For these, it would have been too light. Still probably could have read them, but it would have been very light. So what I did was I just I used convert entities. So I went convert entities, and I selected this face, and I said select all inner loops and click check. I did the same thing for this one, for all of them. And I just selected everything, and I said offset. So, and I typed in 0.2, I believe, and clicked reverse. And by doing that, oh, I can actually see what I typed in, actually. 0.2, yeah. So by doing that, I got an extra. So this is the original cut, and this is the offset inwards. And I did that for all of them. By doing that, I did an extrude boss again. So if you zoom way in, you'll see that now there's basically 2 lines making up the numbers. And that way, when it is doing that high-speed cut that's sort of an engrave process, it does it twice right next to each other to make it a little bit darker. So yeah, that's the whole design process. I went ahead and did all the cutting, and couldn't get that done till late last night because it was too hot to use the laser cutter most of the day. This morning I got the shelf all assembled and put some stuff on it, and yeah, it's working out pretty well, other than now I'm thinking I might want to make another one, and actually, I don't know if I actually will, but I've got this available, and really the biggest trouble is doing all the measuring again. That's the main thing that's discouraging me from making another one. But yeah, so that's the design. If you have any questions, please post. Otherwise, see you in the next video.